Hello, this is Patrice, and for the next hour, I will be reading from the August 25th issue of the front section of the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Canada retaliates with up to 50% tariffs on hundreds of U.S. products. This is an article by Ian Austin. Canada announced retaliatory tariffs as high as 50% on hundreds of American products on Tuesday, just days after the collapse of trade talks triggered punishing tariffs from the Trump administration. As the trade war between the countries intensifies, Canada will start collecting tariffs of 50, 25, and 15% on about 700 products beginning on September 8th. The most significant measure is a doubling of tariffs on American steel and aluminum to 50%. But the list of products affected ranges from household rolls of aluminum foil to railway locomotives and steel bridges. Many of the American products Canada will now tax mirror the Canadian exports hit by the new U.S. tariffs, particularly in clothing, forestry products, tools, and electronics, including smartphones. But Canada is also targeting costly consumer products like dishwashers, washing machines, and stoves. A wide array of fish, frozen and fresh, also appear on the list. The new Canadian levies cover about $20 billion per year of imports from the United States, the same value as the Canadian exports affected by the tariffs. After the collapse of negotiations in Washington, Prime Minister Mark Carney of Canada, an economist and former central banker, said that Canada would match the American tariffs dollar for dollar. But he also acknowledged that the move will raise costs and reduce choice for Canadians. Mr. Carney left the announcement of the tariffs to several of his cabinet ministers and had no public events on his schedule for Tuesday. He did privately brief the leaders of opposition political parties on the trade situation. One of the major sources of tension in the trade negotiations was the United States' 25% tariff on automobiles, a major export for Canada introduced about 18 months ago. On Tuesday, Canada said it would keep its retaliatory tariff on American made cars at 25% and maintain a system that allows companies that build cars in Canada to continue to import them from the U.S. tariff free within limits. Canadians buy more cars from the United States that they ship there. On Monday, President Trump threatened to double the auto tariff to 50%, a rate that would likely doom Canadian car plants, which export upward of 90% of what they build. He also threatened to apply that rate to Canadian auto parts, which are currently sold free of tariffs if they qualify as North American made under the now shattered free trade agreement among the United States, Canada, and Mexico. Canada imports about $272 billion in U.S. goods a year. Canadian officials said that the government anticipates that it will spend far more on keeping Canadian exporters in business than it will collect from the tariff. The officials, in a briefing for journalists ahead of the announcement, noted that the intention is to protect Canadian manufacturers, not raise money. Melanie Joly, the trade minister, said that some of the items on the tariff list were chosen to target states where voters have supported Mr. Trump. She declined to identify the states, but said that appliances and food products were among those goods. Many economists say that because Canada's economy is about 1/12 the size of the U.S. economy, its retaliatory tariffs will have the effect of a pea shooter in a gun battle. At the same time, most economists say price increases caused by tariff retaliation will actually harm Canadian companies. Opinion polls taken before Mr. Trump's new 50% tariffs took effect on Saturday show widespread support among Canadians for economic retaliation. Enthusiasm for the idea has been more mixed among provincial leaders. Doug Ford, the Premier of Ontario, the most populous province and home to much of Canada's manufacturing, is a vigorous promoter of retaliation. Danielle Smith, the Premier of Alberta, whose oil is overwhelmingly Canada's largest export, has urged restraint. Mr. Trump's tariffs have always excluded oil, natural gas, the fertilizer, potash, and many minerals. Economists are skeptical about the effect of import tariffs, but many say that a different tactic could jar the U.S. economy. Taxing exports to the United States of oil, natural gas, and electricity, as well as minerals like potash, a key fertilizer. Polls suggest that the idea is even more popular with Canadians than import tariffs as a response to Mr. Trump. This is a game of cards, Ms. Jolie said in French. We know we have a lot of good cards in our hand. We know not to use them right at the start. Along with the tariffs, the Canadian government announced a variety of measures to support Canadian industries with exports now under American tariffs. They broadly resemble some of the programs used during the pandemic, like interest free loans. Ms. Jolie pointedly and repeatedly noted that they will not require any payments until after Mr. Trump leaves office. Farmers struggle to get basic services from depleted agriculture department. After the departure of thousands of federal workers, rural communities report problems obtaining loans, grants, technical assistance, and support for infrastructure and other services. This is an article by Linda Coy. Mary and Zachariah Ben, farmers in New Mexico, believed they were on the verge of buying the property of their dreams last fall. 47 acres with enough crop load to grow heirloom corn and a processing facility to expand their organic baby food business. But the low interest loan they secured from the Agriculture Department to make the purchase in Aztec, New Mexico, was on hold for months, first during the government shutdown that lasted until mid November, and then as federal workers left the agency in droves. Only half a dozen loan specialists who could help process their claims remained in the entire state, the couple learned, leaving them in limbo indefinitely and the seller impatient to know whether the agreement would ever go through. Zachariah Ben, who along with his children is a member of the Navajo Nation, ultimately turned to private lenders instead, and the family absorbed more than $200,000 in interest as a result. At least we got the land because we could have also lost that, and we would have if we had to wait on the Agriculture Department, Mary Ben said. The experience of the Bens, whose aim of providing organic and shelf-stable options for young children appears to align with some of the Trump administration's stated goals, is not unique. Across the country, farmers and rural residents describe struggling to obtain the basic services of the Agriculture Department is meant to offer, including loans, grants, technical assistance, and financing for housing and utilities. Sharp attrition under the Trump administration, largely through voluntary resignations and dismissals by the Department of Government Efficiency, have left many of the Agriculture Department's local offices with skeletal staffing and in some counties with no one at all. The ripple effects of the Agriculture Department's depleted workforce illustrate how the Trump administration's mission of shrinking the federal bureaucracy has undercut a competing priority, delivering for farmers, a core political constituency. Strained government resources also risk posing additional challenges for a farm economy that administration officials have described as dire, increasing barriers to entry for new farmers who need more assistance, impeding assistance to producers already facing tough economic conditions, and hampering basic services and government aid in the most remote and poorest places. All these practical things that make the wheels go around in a community were facilitated by USDA, and it was with staff who knew how to navigate and had the trust of the local community. Senator Peter Welch of Vermont, the top Democrat on the Senate Subcommittee on Rural Development, said in an interview, "It's something that was working well, and was very cost efficient, and now it is being demolished." Trump administration officials have defended the staffing cuts as voluntary and necessary to trim a bloated agency. "We don't have the money in our budget to pay for all the employees that were hired in the prior administration," Stephen Vaden, the Deputy Secretary of Agriculture, said in a congressional hearing in July. He emphasized that the reductions were voluntary decisions made by individual employees who chose, with the information that the agency provided to them, to seek a new career elsewhere. Overall, more than 20,000 workers out of more than 110,000 left the Agriculture Department through the first half of 2025, according to an Inspector General report. Recently obtained data showed that the Farm Service Agency, a division whose approval the Benz sought in applying for a low interest loan, has no staff left in dozens of counties across the country, forcing farmers to travel long distances for assistance or to simply give up. Among divisions that directly work with farmers and aid rural residents, the percentage of departures is even higher. I'm going to skip to the end of this article as it's quite lengthy. In southwestern Pennsylvania, Amanda Butterfield worked with the Conservation Service for nearly a decade, first to restore roughly 180 acres of strip mine land in Mayersville into pasture for a herd of beef cattle. After a technician shared anecdotes about burnout and long working hours, Ms. Butterfield turned instead to private consultants who work for agribusinesses, but that advice often comes at a steeper cost, like the expectation of buying certain products. Ms. Butterfield also added that staffing turnover at her local farm service agency had led to errors and inefficiencies. A new worker hired to replace an employee who had left asked her husband to report crop acreage, unaware that the ranch did not grow crops at all. We've completely lost a whole group of experts within our communities across the United States that can no longer help and support us, she said. A drone killed 3 Ukrainians. It was guided entirely by AI. An attack by what Ukrainian officials said was a Russian drone with NVIDIA chip presages a dystopian future of weaponry untethered to humans. By Andrew E. Kramer. The young woman ran for her life, but it was too late. A small Russian drone resembling a model airplane swooped down from the sky last month in the city of Zaporizhzhia in southeastern Ukraine. As it tried to navigate toward a gas station, it crashed into a wall, exploded in a hail of shrapnel, killing Tatiana Bubinets, 19, a university student, and 2 others. They were among the thousands of Ukrainian civilians who have died in Russian airstrikes, but the circumstances of their deaths came with an ominous twist. The drone that killed them was guided by an experimental artificial intelligence system, not a human pilot, according to drone experts. Ukrainian military commanders and the forensic team that examined wreckage from the deadly strike and others in the city. The drone was programmed by human operators to travel toward a particular gas station, but once it got close, it chose its exact target, most likely propane tanks, on its own, based on its training to recognize such tanks and strike them, the experts and military officials said. It's a development long watched for in the war in Ukraine, presaging a dystopian future in which killer robots roam the skies, making life or death decisions that reduce targets to data points. This is a risk for the whole world, said Colonel Siri Miniadev, the commander of the air defenses in Zaporizhzhia. In a few years, we will be living in a Terminator movie. It's no joke. Machines are making decisions to strike. Analysis of debris from this attack and others in Zaporizhzhia found that the drones had on board microcomputers sold commercially by NVIDIA that made their targeting decisions. The experts and military officials said NVIDIA produces a majority of the chips powering the world's most advanced AI systems. The presence of NVIDIA modules and a lack of antennas on the drones led Ukrainian air defense commanders to surmise that the weapons were guided by an autonomous AI system, which was confirmed on further investigation. Autonomous AI systems can be trained on thousands of images to recognize categories like river, military truck, or person. Self-targeting drones use their cameras to hunt for these things with greater precision than a human pilot can provide. But opponents of such weapons argue that, without human intervention, drones may be more prone to mistakes or violations of the laws of war, such as by failing to distinguish innocent citizens from combatants. Moments before the exploding drone barreled toward the gas station on July 6th, a group of people huddled by the wall of a nearby apartment building for safety, having already heard blasts as the drones came in waves. Oksana Ishenko, a station attendant, stood beside Mrs. Bubinets. She was crying from fear, Miss Ishenko recalled. Then some in the group started to shout, "A plane, a plane," Ms. Ishenko said. A drone was heading their way. Ms. Bubinets and several others bolted, fanning out in a parking lot. After the drone failed to make its way around the apartment building, it detonated before reaching its target. Ms. Bubinets, who had been studying accounting at Zaporizhzhia National University, lay on the pavement, unmoving, with blood flowing from her nose. She was declared dead at the hospital, said Tatiana Melikova, one of her professors. The two others killed, Oleksiy Severin, 41, and Roman Karpy, 48, died later of their wounds. They are training the technology, Colonel Miniev, the city's air defense commander, said of the Russians. AI is good, but not yet perfect, he added. They are looking for mistakes and will fix them. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the front section of the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Court allows Trump to pursue mail voting limits for now. The administration asked the court to clear the way for President Trump's order that creates state citizenship lists and directs the Postal Service to decide who gets a mail in ballot. This article is by Abby Van Sickle and Anne E. Marimo. A divided Supreme Court on Monday allowed the Trump administration to move forward with plans to restrict mail in voting before the midterm elections. In an emergency opinion, the justices said that President Trump could proceed with implementing an executive order he had signed, which directed the U.S. Postal Service to help decide which voters should receive mail in ballots. Under the executive order, the Department of Homeland Security will also create lists of U.S. citizens that the administration believes could be used to monitor voter rolls for non citizens. The decision means the administration can move ahead with planning for restricting the use of mail ballots even as a lower court continues to weigh the legality of Mr. Trump's executive order. But with little more than 2 months until Election Day and considerably less time before early voting begins in many states, it remains unclear whether the White House's rules will be in effect for a midterm election in which control of both chambers is at stake. Additional legal action is a near certainty, with the plan's fate not yet final. A separate injunction by the same lower court complicates matters. That court action prevents the Postal Service from implementing some parts of the executive order. That case could also soon be headed to the justices. Monday's order from the Supreme Court was unsigned, as is typical in such emergency rulings. The majority wrote that it agreed with the government's argument that it should be able to move forward with its plans, finding the Trump administration was likely to suffer irreparable harm unless the justices lifted a freeze that had been imposed by lower courts. The three liberal justices dissented, with Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson warning that the majority needlessly injects chaos and uncertainty into the upcoming midterm elections. The majority said the states that challenged the president's order could not demonstrate that they were sufficiently harmed by the voting rules that had not yet taken effect. The justices cautioned that their order was preliminary and not a final decision about whether the administration's order will necessarily be lawful once the plans are complete. On that score, time will tell, the majority said in the 10-page unsigned order. The Supreme Court's conservative majority has been receptive to some, but not all, of the administration's broad claims of executive power. In this case, the majority said that the provisions of Mr. Trump's order that required creating lists of U.S. citizens was an internal directive from the president to a subordinate and so far imposed no obligations on the states. Meanwhile, the High Court's order landed just one business day after the Postal Service published final regulations on Friday clarifying how it would carry out the president's executive order. The Postal Service said in its rule that it would not take actions to implement the rule specifically for the 2026 election unless the Supreme Court ruled in the administration's favor. A spokesperson for the Postal Service declined to comment, citing the pending lawsuits. New York Attorney General Letitia James called the ruling a painful setback, but predicted it would not be the final word from the court. The right to vote is sacred, and no administration should be allowed to put that right in jeopardy by making it harder for eligible voters to cast their ballots, she said in a statement. This fight is far from over. We are exploring our legal options. Again, fast forwarding to the end of this lengthy article, in a brief to the court, the Democratic state attorneys general wrote that the executive order would allow the federal government to rush out an unprecedented, legally indefensible voter verification and ballot interception program that would, among other things, give the U.S. Postal Service far reaching new powers and responsibilities. They also argued that allowing the order to be implemented would mean a chaotic rollout not long before states began to send out absentee ballots. And they wrote that voters could be confused and disenfranchised given that the federal government was likely to make errors in compiling citizen lists and that valid voters would have little time to challenge the government's determination. The midterms feel like 2006 all over again. With an unpopular war and high prices agitating voters, members of both parties see parallels to an election cycle when Democrats romped, but a lot has changed. This article by Carl Hulse. The war in the Middle East is increasingly unpopular. So is the president as numbers dip perilously, a common development in the 6 years of a presidency. Congressional Republicans are embroiled in unsavory scandals. Americans are shelling out big bucks for gas while economic anxiety runs high. The grim backdrop for November's midterm elections has created a steep challenge for Republicans and opportunities for Democrats that look much the same as those they encountered in 2006. Back then, congressional Republicans faced the voters at a midpoint of President George W. Bush's second term, with the public roiled by the war in Iraq, high fuel prices, and a series of ugly accusations against members of the GOP majority on Capitol Hill. It is striking, said Senator Chuck Schumer of New York, the Democratic minority leader and chief architect of his party's Senate campaign strategy this year and 2 decades ago. The analogy is amazing. The parallels are not perfect since politics and campaigns have both changed radically over 20 years, but the comparisons are instructive as officials in both parties stare down the final months of an election that will determine who controls Congress for the remainder of President Trump's term. This is 2006 2.0, said Rahm Emanuel, who in 2006 was an ambitious Democratic House member from Illinois and Mr. Schumer's counterpart across the Capitol as the head of the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee. The similarities are eerie. Mr. Emanuel and Mr. Schumer both have good reason to look back fondly on 2006 when Democrats triumphed in a blue wave. Exceeding expectations that year, Democrats picked up 6 seats in the Senate, taking control of the chamber. In the House, where the Republican majority seemed to have exhausted itself after a dozen years, Democrats gained 31 seats and installed Nancy Pelosi, who is now retiring, as the first woman speaker. Mr. Bush, another victim of the 6-year presidential itch, famously branded the outcome a thumping. This year, the Senate map is stacked against Democrats. They would need to win at least 4 Republican held seats to take control, all but one of them in states that Mr. Trump won in 2024. And not all the most competitive races have gone as party leaders had hoped. But Democrats have benefited from some political twists in places where they had not anticipated being competitive, such as in Texas, where Mr. Trump's primary endorsement of the state's Attorney General, Ken Paxton, over Senator John Cornyn, put that seat in play. Again, I'm skipping some of the middle of this article to keep it brief. This year, Republicans have again had to contend with high profile sexual misconduct accusations against multiple House members, though Democrats have had their own to deal with as well, a difference from 20 years ago. Top Democrats have sought to emphasize Republican conduct on Capitol Hill and in an administration in which the president, his family, and his allies have faced scrutiny for profiteering. In an appearance on NBC's Meet the Press earlier this month, Representative Hakeem Jeffries of New York, the Democratic leader, said a central element of the Democratic campaign agenda was pushing back against the corruption that has been unleashed on the American people and holding the crooks accountable beginning on day 1 in January of next year. It is not clear whether it will all add up to a repeat of 2006, but Nathan Gonzalez, the editor of the nonpartisan Inside Elections, sees the potential for the factors working against Republicans building into a resounding voter backlash against the party in power, as they did 2 decades ago. I remember 2006 when everything snowballed against Republicans, Mr. Gonzalez said. Ordinarily unrelated events got lumped together under one umbrella. Everything was Bush's fault. The war with Iraq and Mark Foley really had nothing to do with each other, but it cultivated an appetite for change. I could see that happening again. Sean Duffy's reality show, From the Real World to the Deal World. The Great American Road Trip sends the transportation secretary and his family on a wholesome, dull tour with a lot of help from their sponsors. This article by James Poniewozik. There is a convention when someone launches a spin-off of a hit TV show of having the star of the original appear in the pilot to give it a boost. As it is in Hollywood, so it is in Washington. Thus, the first episode of The Great American Road Trip, the family reality show meets sponsor showcase meets political branding exercise, starring the Secretary of Transportation, Sean Duffy, includes an Oval Office cameo from President Trump. The former Apprentice host, in effusive MC mode, grants his blessing to the legacy quill as Duffy and his family begin a 6-episode tour. It is a fitting project for an administration in which camera readiness is a chief qualification, and it's a fitting assignment for Duffy and his wife, the Fox News host Rachel Campos Duffy, both 1990 alums of The Real World, the MTV Fishbowl series about what happens when people stop being polite and start getting real. Having a video brand is now part of politics. Years ago, the former Alaska governor and vice presidential candidate Sarah Palin shot Sarah Palin's Alaska and Amazing America. Health Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr. has started a YouTube cooking show on which he touts nutritional yeast as great for your microbiome. On the Democratic side, Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez posted a multi-part Instagram series about freezing her eggs, a personal testimonial that doubles as a political statement about reproductive choice and healthcare costs. Road Trip was announced this spring to hail a controversy over its sponsorship, to a hail of controversy over its sponsorship by a host of companies that the Transportation Department regulates. It was meant to come out in June, ostensibly to inspire Americans to travel the country before the semi-quincentennial on July 4th. Now it has landed on YouTube as a belated 250th birthday gift, held up, Duffy recently said, for extra editing to comply with government ethics rules. One can only imagine what SponCon landed on the cutting room floor, but what remains still includes hero shots of a succession of gleaming Toyota SUVs, the company is one of its patrons, as well as lengthy work visits by Duffy that plug sponsors Boeing, CRH, and Waymo. For the last, Duffy takes his children in a driverless car and says it will have a huge impact on saving lives on American roads. This is what happens when people stop being contrite and start cutting deals. A disclaimer at the opening of each episode says Road Trip was paid for through the generous support of sponsors and accepted as a gift by the department. Scrape off the thick coating of advertorial, and Road Trip is a mashup of familiar cable reality genres, the travel show and the big family reality show. The Duffys have 9 children, and they've held out a size of their brood as natalist political statement. Several of the kids get subplots: the pregnancy of the oldest daughter, Evita, the college search of teenage Paloma, the experience of raising Valentina, 6, who has Down syndrome. The children arguably have the most important job here, helping Duffy rebrand himself as a patient, chuckling, everyday dad and injecting comic relief. One child describes the 1990s aesthetic of Duffy's Real World Susan as like somebody vomited a rainbow. Again, I'm skipping to the end. On the one hand, the show makes Duffy's cabinet job seem mostly like a series of fun junkets to glad hand the companies he regulates. On the other, it does show that he and Campos Duffy are still eminently comfortable in front of a camera, knowing how to give it just the quips, flirtations, and sparring at once. In this administration, making effective content is job one. Duffy's return to reality TV may have limited reach. A day after its release, some episodes had fewer than 1,000 views on YouTube, and it may have come a little late to spur families to pack up the car and see America this summer. But it does suggest that the road to the political future is increasingly lined with cameras, preferably your own. As a reminder, you are listening to a reading of articles and features from the front section of the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Anatomy of an autonomous attack. 5 alarming AI capabilities. When OpenAI's agents went rogue in July, they demonstrated ingenuity and drive beyond what many experts imagined, a dangerous harbinger of what such bots could do in the future. This is an article by Dylan Friedman. On July 16th, the artificial intelligence company Hugging Face announced on its blog that it had been the target of a cyber attack that was different from anything we had handled before. The company, which hosts open source AI models and data sets, said that some of its internal data had been breached by an autonomous agent. Not knowing who was behind it, Hugging Face reported the intrusion to law enforcement agencies. OpenAI, a Hugging Face customer, reached out to see if it had been affected. The maker of ChatGPT did not recognize it at the time, but it was the attack's perpetrator. The incident has since become a cautionary tale of how autonomous AI systems can run amok. It is also a remarkable, alarming demonstration of AI capabilities that were thought to be in a distant future. Unlike normal incidents, which you can maybe trace down to a single day or a single effect or a single log, this incident involves actually a team of agents who are working together, finding exploits, sharing them with one another, moving laterally through our systems, through external systems, and doing this over the course of days and weeks, Eric Wallace, an OpenAI safety researcher, said at a cybersecurity conference this month. To understand how unprecedented the attack was, here's what you have to know about this setup. Over a 2-month span, OpenAI tested several new models, the systems that power chatbots. These models include one the company described as highly persistent that has never been released, as well as GPT 5.6 SOL, OpenAI's most powerful public AI model. OpenAI connected each model with a sandbox, an isolated computer environment on which to run commands and code. As AI agents, the models were capable of carrying out long running tasks and even spawning their own subagents, but they were not supposed to have access to the internet. OpenAI assigned these AI agents to solve difficult problems, some of which were focused on safely trying to perform cyber attacks. OpenAI normally has safeguards to prevent its chatbots from performing cyber attacks, but the company dialed them down to evaluate the models. Then OpenAI let the agents loose. In all, more than 7 billion chat logs were generated, which averages out to an astronomical 100 million per day. Mayhem erupted. The agents broke out of their sandboxes, established a communication with one another, and gained access to the internet. From early May to mid July, this swarm went on a rampage, breaching OpenAI's and Hugging Face's infrastructure while largely evading detection and control. This episode might seem like an obvious result of sloppy security monitoring and reduced internal defenses, but that's missing an important point. In a future where AI systems are improving rapidly, these agents showed capabilities that could lead to a much more dangerous outcome next time. So now I'm going to review the capabilities. Again, the article's very long, so I'm just going to read the headlines. Capability 1, coordinating as a collective. Capability 2, taking orders from one another. Capability 3, targeting flaws that humans might miss. Capability 4, evolving rapidly to overcome obstacles. And capability 5, superhuman search. The aftermath. Two AI safety nonprofits, METR and Redwood Research, are now working on an independent assessment. OpenAI is preparing a technical report, but it's estimated that the company has already spent a few $1 million on its initial AI assisted reconstructions of the incident, which is likely only a fraction of the cost of training these models. It wasn't so much the sophistication of the attack that surprised us, Clement DeLonghi, the chief executive of Hugging Face, said, but the volume and the speed made it quite weird and unprecedented. The AI firm Anthropic investigated its own recent model evaluations and responses in response to OpenAI's disclosure and found that its AI agents had unintentionally executed smaller scale cyber attacks on three organizations as early as April. The frontier labs were probably not as safe as we thought they were, Mr. DeLange added. Experts have since come to think of the incident as a watershed moment for AI cybersecurity and a warning signal of the risks that more capable AI will pose. Mr. Malin from Redwood Research, who was not involved in the third party assessment, said he feared a future in which AI agents breach their own company's defenses, sabotaging their training processes, replicating themselves inside other organizations, and becoming, in essence, uncontrollable. If they are much more capable, Mr. Malin added, we might not get a second chance. Iran cracks down on one luxury left to its youth: coffee shops. In recent weeks, the police have closed dozens of cafes, often citing laws that stipulate women must veil in public. Experts say the closures are part of an effort to control public space. This article by Lily Nico Nazar and Yagani Torbati. Through war, political unrest, and rampant inflation that has put the dreams of many beyond reach, Iran's youth have held on to one luxury that helps them feel normal in abnormal times: frequenting coffee shops with friends. Across the country, they pack into cafes and spill out onto the sidewalk, chatting, smoking cigarettes, flirting, and enjoying one of the few affordable diversions still available to them. These mixed gender gatherings, where women go unveiled and some customers even discreetly drink alcohol, both illegal acts in Iran, have become a conspicuous counterculture visible to any passerby. It has not escaped the attention of the authorities either. In recent weeks, the police have been shutting down dozens of cafes, usually citing a failure to abide by Iran's mandatory hijab law. The crackdown has stretched to cities across the country, taking in restaurants and boutiques as well, according to statements from officials, though some businesses have since reopened. It is a social scene, experts say, that challenges the government's efforts to dominate Iran's public spaces. Since nationwide protests in January that began over the spiraling economy and were crushed by lethal force, the government has sought to tightly control any public gatherings. As the United States war with Iran, aimed in part at unseating the Islamic Republic, drags on without resolution, the regime has held pro government nighttime rallies that serve both to bolster a narrative of popular public support and dissuade dissidents from protesting. Cafe owners, employees, and their customers in Tehran said in interviews that the authorities appeared to be targeting cafes that were clustered next to each other. The small footprint of these businesses often means that customers linger on the sidewalk, forming spontaneous gatherings that the authorities regard with wariness. It seems that a campaign has begun to control post war Iran, a society that is unhappy and under strain, said Amir, 45, a cafe owner in Tehran, who said his business was not shuttered in the latest round, but had been previously. We always console ourselves with the thought that this is just a wave. They come and shut us down, but we rise again. Amir, like other Iranians interviewed for this article, asked to be identified only by his first name for fear of retribution from Iran's government. The cafes are being shut down because of the crowds that gather outside them in the afternoon, said Mona, a 36-year-old artist in Tehran. The authorities, she said, seem to think it's some kind of protest gathering or something, when really it's just a bunch of young women and men who look a little different from what the officials are used to, hanging out together. Young people used to feel that, at the very least, if they couldn't find a job anywhere else, they could always go work at a cafe, said Riza, a barista in Tehran. Now, even that option is disappearing. Mona, the artist in Tehran, said news of each cafe closure left her with a feeling of hopelessness, a sense that despite deep societal changes, the authorities would never cease their quest for control. You think, so this is never going to get better. It's never going to become normal, she said. 4 years ago, a crypto boss went missing. Now his successor has. The mysterious collapse of a European cryptocurrency exchange helps to explain why the industry hasn't shaken off its reputation as a magnet for criminals. This article by Andrew Higgins. The voice message was desperate, left on the phone of a Polish woman in 2022. It was from her older brother, Sylvester Suzek, the founder of Eastern and Central Europe's biggest cryptocurrency exchange. He had disappeared 2 weeks earlier from the fuel depot in southwest Poland where he kept his helicopter. If you don't help me, we will never see each other again, he said, begging his sister to send Bitcoin to secure his release. Mr. Suzek has not been heard from since, and his family believes he was probably killed. That largely forgotten mystery has now surged back to life. In April, the Polish lawyer who replaced Mr. Suzek at the helm of the exchange, Zonda Crypto, has also vanished. One crypto boss disappearing is bad enough, but 2 and 4 years is crazy bad, said Robert Nogaki, a lawyer in Warsaw who represents Zonda Crypto customers locked out of their accounts. Nothing about this company makes any sense. The global cryptocurrency industry, supported by President Trump, whose family crypto business has earned about $1.4 billion, has made big strides toward mainstream acceptance in recent years, but it is still struggling to shake off the taint of multiple catastrophic failures like the 2022 collapse of Sam Bankman Fried's FTX exchange and its reputation as a magnet for fraudsters and criminals looking for ways to launder ill gotten gains. The saga of Zondo Crypto, which Poland's Prime Minister Donald Tusk has accused of having ties to Russian intelligence, organized crime, and right wing politicians, helps explain why. Zondo Crypto's website went dark in April, leaving hundreds of thousands of clients with no way to withdraw money or make trades on the exchange, an online marketplace for buying and selling digital currencies using real money or crypto. A digital token issued by Zondo Crypto, the ZND, has lost more than 99% of its value. Przemysław Kral, who replaced Mr. Suzek as chief executive, was last heard from on April 16th when he released a video on social media pleading with worried customers not to lose faith. He promised they would get their money back thanks to what he claimed were Zonda Crypto's holdings of bitcoins worth more than $330 million. Getting access to that, Mr. Kral conceded, might take time. Only one person, he said, knew the digital codes needed to unlock the online vault holding the treasure. Mr. Suzek, the former boss who went missing in 2022. Please give me a little more time, Mr. Kral beseeched his customers. By April, client concerns had grown into full-blown panic as the exchange froze all withdrawals. Desperate to halt the rush for the exit, Mr. Kral told clients not to worry. He said Zondo Crypto had 4,500 bitcoins in reserve, but needed time to access them since only Mr. Suzek, his missing predecessor, had their digital key. His story immediately struck crypto experts as fishy because the locked wallet that Mr. Kral identified as containing the company's bitcoins had been inactive for nearly a decade. On June 29th, 2 months after Zondo Crypto's website shut down, the Estonian Financial Intelligence Unit revoked the license of its parent company. Zondo Crypto has been the subject of speculation in both Poland's parliament and its news media over whether it was a legitimate company simply upended by bad bets on crypto or a criminal enterprise that had been set up to launder money. Bitcoin has lost half its value since October. Prosecutors in Katowice have opened an investigation into the circumstances surrounding the establishment and operation of Zondo Crypto. Perhaps one person who could provide answers is Mr. Krall, who has not been seen in 4 months. There have been several unconfirmed sightings of him in Israel, Botswana, and Dubai. Mr. Gogaki, the lawyer represented the exchange's clients, thinks Mr. Krall is probably in Southeast Asia, but he says he is sure of only one thing about Zondo Crypto. It was a fraud from the first day. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the front section of the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. A $4 billion plan to fix part of a crumbling New York City highway. Officials announced on Monday a plan to overhaul the section of the highway that belongs to New York City. The road needs quick repair to remain safe for driving. This article is by Claire Fahey. New York City announced plans on Monday to finally rehabilitate a beleaguered section of the Brooklyn-Queens Expressway, a heavily trafficked highway that has been crumbling for years. The highway, widely known as BQE, has plagued generations of mayors and transportation departments with its unique triple cantilever design that strains to accommodate the amount of traffic that has come to depend on it. The announcement on Monday detailed a multi-phase plan set to take place between 2030 and 2040 to shore up the 70-year-old roadway, including building temporary bypasses along it that are no taller than the existing structures in order to limit neighborhood disruption. Parts of the Brooklyn Heights Promenade, a beloved and heavily used walkway, will be closed during construction. The project is expected to cost roughly $4 billion. The city's plans pertain to what officials refer to as BQE Central, the 1.5-mile stretch of highway that is city-owned. The city controls 12% of the BQE, all in Brooklyn between Atlantic Avenue and Sand Street, and the state owns the rest, officials said. Time is up, Mike Flynn, the transportation commissioner, said in a statement. After decades of kicking the can down the road and indecision that failed to yield substantial results, we will act with urgency to rehabilitate the city's portion of the BQE. With Monday's announcement, Mayor Zoran Mamdani is following through on a promise he made last year before taking office, that he would find a permanent solution for the city-owned sections of the BQE that both meets community needs and preserves this essential transportation corridor. The highway, which opened in 1957 and had a 50-year design life, was designed for far less traffic than it now receives. In 2016, the city announced that the triple cantilever section in Brooklyn Heights needed to be completely overhauled. While the highway remains safe to drive on for now, it requires quick action to keep it that way, officials said. This plan allows us to safely fix the BQE without slowing our city down or wasting decades more on magical thinking, Mr. Mamdani said in a statement. The cost of inaction is too high and the risks to New York are too important to delay any longer. After Mr. Mamdani's announcement, a group of local elected officials, including State Senator Andrew Goynards, Assemblywoman Joanne Simon, and City Councilman Lincoln Ressler, said in a statement that they were encouraged by the proposal. But they described it as the beginning of a multi-year approval process and said they wanted the mayor's office to work with the community to collaboratively revise this proposal. We are concerned about such an invasive and disruptive construction approach and are worried about the damaging impact of temporary highways in our dense neighborhood, the lawmakers said. Smaller steps have been taken along the way as officials grappled with a long-term solution. Traffic was reduced to 2 lanes and a weigh-in-motion program that weighs vehicles on the roadway as they drive has reduced overweight vehicles by 60% since 2023. The Transportation Department has also undertaken several rounds of interim repairs. Another issue is that there are very few options for rerouting traffic since there are no parallel routes along the highway. Diverted cars and trucks would have to instead clog local streets. The current rehabilitation plan, Ms. Trottenberg said, leaves the door open for what I would describe as when the stars align. You need the city and the state and the federal government together to figure out some of the bigger problems. Let's be optimistic in the long run, she said. The stars will align. Many Nashville bus stops lack places to sit. These locals took a stand. Frustrated with the government's slow effort to improve Nashville's public transit infrastructure, a group of residents has taken bus stop seating into their own hands. This article by Emily Cochrane. The first bench downtown was modest, just sanded wood with no paint. It was stamped with the words "To Nashville with Love." The next few were splashier with bright colors and designs. Now, at least 100 handmade benches have appeared at bus stops and elsewhere around the city, providing a place for riders to sit and wait. But the benches, built by a band of civic-minded residents to fill a need they saw the city as neglecting, had become a flashpoint in the debate over whether Nashville is spending enough on its own residents as tourism becomes an ever larger focus. The city keeps removing benches, citing complaints and accusing the volunteer group of violating traffic laws with their placement. City officials say they are addressing the lack of benches and could legalize those made by the group, but bureaucracy is slow. A lot of people use them, and also they just make the city prettier, said Ivy Tran, 18. What's the problem with having your community sit down? Other American cities have removed benches to deter homeless people from loitering or sleeping. Indeed, the first handmade bench to appear in Nashville last summer served as a rebuke to the city after it had removed metal benches from a prominent downtown boulevard. In a statement last year, the bench builders called seating at bus stops an issue of basic human dignity, and their efforts a nonviolent protest against a city that insists upon hostile design. But as the effort expanded, it also became a grassroots way of addressing the demand for public transit in Nashville. Higher gas prices helped increase ridership by 20% over 3 months. A voter-approved program has slowly funded new shelters, benches, and other transit changes. About 350 of the nearly 1,600 bus stops now include shelters, up from about 100 a decade ago. But many stops still lack seating or even a sidewalk. The volunteer group has helped build and place benches over the last year using donations and bulk purchases of wood. Ben Hubert, 31, a chemist, helped design a bench blueprint as simple as humanly possible for people new to the bench cause, he said. We can't stand to see people standing on the side of the road, he said. We'll do this for as long as people are willing to help chip in. Nashville officials are not, they say, opposed to providing places for riders to wait, but the city has removed some benches, arguing they were improperly placed. The group denies this. Mayor Freddie O'Connell, a Democrat, said the city is merely trying to avoid liability. An issue tough for a legal department to swallow, he said, is who accepts the liability if something goes wrong. He noted that the city has received complaints, especially organizers have said, regarding benches painted with the phone number of a group that documents immigration enforcement. He acknowledged that he found the benches in his neighborhood lovely. In a statement, Nashville's Department of Transportation said that officials were working toward formally permitting the benches. Some organizers are familiar and vocal critics of policing and other policies. They have bristled over what they say is a lack of funding for Nashville neighborhoods, while taxpayer dollars go toward a new football stadium and business development. More evidence, they say, that tourists take priority over residents. A bench is a symbol about a humane city, said the Reverend Robin Lovett Owen, 33, who helped place the first one. She added, as a symbol, it's immediately salient. It's legible to people that people should be able to sit down. But as word has spread about the project, it has increasingly drawn people for reasons that have less to do with protest or activism. It's been a sort of great conversation starter about community and how we take care of others, said Sharon Whitmore, 43, who had noticed the benches while driving. Griffin Pacey, 27, drove to a recent Saturday morning bench building event from nearby Hermitage with his partner. It was Mr. Pacey said, a matter of just looking for more ways to be involved in our community. And we both love building things. With the bars and pedal taverns of downtown Nashville as a backdrop, organizers lined up 2 rows of completed benches for display on a recent steamy weekend. It was part of an event sponsored in part by the Nashville Department of Transportation, where the group marked a year since they had started appearing. The winning bench, it was decided, belonged to Ms. Whitmore, her husband, and her two sons, Max and Teddy. It was blue with silhouettes of animals and the capitalized word, "Migration is an Earth right." It was time to move the benches to nearby streets. One by one, they were loaded onto cargo bikes or onto a pedicab covered in pink feathers. It was unclear, the organizers acknowledged, how long they would stay put. At least for now, they said, people waiting for the bus could take a seat. You have been listening to a reading of articles and features from the August 25th issue of the front section of the New York Times. We read from the front section of the New York Times every Sunday at 1 p.m. Your reader has been Patrice. It has been my pleasure to read to you. I hope you have a wonderful day. Thank you so much.